So what my plan is today is to introduce you to the main area that I focus on. But before I do that, I have some special thanks to give to colleagues. Stephanie Shattuck-Hufnagel of MIT has been a close collaborator for close to 20 years now. Jim Scobby of Queen Margaret University. It's always a pleasure to discuss all things articulatory with Jim, and he's been a key collaborator in developing the speech production facility here in Edinburgh that's a joint Queen Margaret University of Edinburgh facility. I'd like to thank Professor Dave Lee, Professor Emeritus of Psychology, University of Edinburgh. He was the one who introduced me to the world of motor control. And on the methodological front, I'd like to thank Alan Wrench from Queen Margaret University and Articulate Instruments. He is the one responsible for making it possible to record articulatory movements of speech in Edinburgh, and he also has some pretty good analysis software that's made analyzing results much easier. I'd like to thank D.K. Arvind of Informatics. He's provided an innovative way of measuring chest movement during breathing, which we're also investigating for use in speech research. And last but not least, I thank Cedric McMartin, whose stellar technical support has made much of the research that I'll tell you about today possible. He's also collaborated with me in directing the laboratories in linguistics and English language, and he's another key collaborator in developing the Edinburgh Speech Production Facility. I've had the great pleasure and privilege of working with many bright students and postdocs, including Corinne Astesano, Matthew Aylett, Tina Kambir-Langeveld, Snezhina Dimitrova, Christian Gang, Cassie Mayo, Satsuki Nakai, Mariko Sugahara, and Lawrence White. I thank the research councils who have supported my work, and I thank my family, in particular my parents, Naomi and Bob Turk, my husband, Bert, our children, Matilda and Jeff. And I'm especially honored tonight by the presence of two of my brothers, Luke and Tom, and by my aunt and uncle, Francis and Joe Bachman, and my cousin Sharon. And thanks to you all for coming. So timing and talking is actually something that you don't notice very much unless it's exceptional in some way, unless people are speaking quickly or especially slowly or in some type of rhythm. But what I hope to show you tonight is that we actually have very sophisticated control of timing even in the most mundane monosyllabic utterance. So speech sounds are produced by movements of the rib cage, of the vocal folds, the jaw, the tongue, and the lips, and the velum. And all of these movements have a temporal dimension, both individually and in their coordinated activity. And what I'll show you now is a video, an X-ray video of speech, and the sound will not be on. And what I invite you to do is to focus on the timing. And what you'll see, I mean, the lips are the hardest things to see here. They're sort of shadowy, but you'll be able to see the gymnastic activity of the tongue as well as the jaw. So what I hoped you noticed was how intertwined the speech timing is with all aspects of speech production. It's actually impossible to talk about any aspect of speech production without considering timing. Now I'll play the same video with the sound turned on. And again, I'd like to invite you to focus on the timing, but I think you'll have a very different temporal experience.
Why did Ken set the soggy net on top of his deck? I have put blood on her 2 clean yellow shoes. Stop.
It's quite an odd utterance spoken by Ken Stevens, but you probably noticed that the speech sounds sounded a lot slower than the impression of the movement. So what I want to do in this talk is focus on 2 questions. What is speech timing for, and how is it controlled? And to answer these questions, we need a way of measuring speech timing. And fortunately, it's fairly straightforward to measure it using visual displays of speech like this one. So this is a visual display of this utterance.
But by the time they finish,
some of you may recognize that voice. In the top panel, you can see what's called a waveform, which represents the amplitude of pressure at the microphone over time. In the bottom panel, you see what's called a spectrogram, which represents the frequency components of speech over time. And the shading represents the relative amplitude of each of the components. And in visual displays like this, it's possible to identify regions that correspond to when the mouth is closed or relatively constricted. So, and these intervals these constriction intervals are associated with consonants. So like t, your mouth is closed because your tongue makes a seal with the roof of your mouth. And so we can measure consonant durations in this way, and we can also measure some vowel durations by measuring the intervals between these consonantal constrictions. Many of these correspond to vowels. So the question of what speech timing is for can be answered using controlled experiments. And many of these were done quite a long time ago in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. So one example, you might ask participants to say something like, say deed again. And then you might change only the vowel and ask them to say dad again. And then you could measure the duration of the vowels in those words or the durations of the whole word. And what you would notice is that the a in dad tends to be longer than the e in deed, possibly because you have to move your jaw further during the production of dad compared to deed. Another example, if you ask participants to say deed again with phrasal stress on deed and compared that with say deed again, phrasal stress on say, you would find that deed with phrasal stress is longer than deed without phrasal stress. And a third example, if you ask someone to say, Mary George's cousin made that cake, or Mary's cousin George made that cake, and you measured durations of the word cousin, what you would find is that cousin before a subject-noun phrase boundary is longer than cousin in the middle of the subject-noun phrase. So words before major syntactic boundaries are longer than elsewhere. So on the basis of experiments like these, people came up with a list of factors that affected speech sound durations. So these factors included things like vowel and consonant type, as well as contextual factors like phrasal stress. We saw syntax, which we saw things like predictability, which is how predictable a word is from context. If a word is more predictable, it tends to be shorter. Adjacent segment type. If a consonant is in a cluster with another consonant, then it's shorter than it is if it's on its own in between two vowels. So these types of factors we tend not to be aware of when we speak. Other factors, which are sometimes called global factors, include things like rate of speech and speech style. So when we speak to a periodic rhythm, there are also some timing adjustments that occur. Speech rate is a very interesting factor, which I'm not going to focus on today, but just to say that speech rate tends to compress speech sounds, but not in a uniform way. So vowels tend to be compressed more than consonants, and pauses tend to be compressed most of all. So this list that I just showed you seems to answer the question, what is speech timing for? We already know. But some of these factors turned out to be problematic, and syntax is one of those factors. It turns out that not all syntactic boundaries are signaled with pausing and or lengthening. So if you have a sentence like, Mary George's cousin ate a piece of cake, there's a bit of lengthening on cousin and maybe a pause. But if you say, her cousin ate a piece of cake, there might be a bit of lengthening on cousin, but there might not always be a boundary there. And if you said she ate a piece of cake, there's not any evidence, I think, of a boundary between she and ate, even though Mary George's cousin, her cousin, and she are all subject noun phrases. So in all of those cases, we have the same syntactic structure, but varying likelihood of an overt signaled boundary in the phonetics, or in the speech pronunciation and timing. So phrasing doesn't mirror syntax exactly. What seems to be going on here is that boundaries are signaled more often in longer utterances. So Mary George's cousin is longer than her cousin, and as a result is more likely to have final lengthening on cousin and even perhaps a pause. And there are other types of cues to boundaries that you hear in speech, and they include things like intonational phenomena, and maybe things like creaky voice as well. So the point here is that longer utterances show more final lengthening and pause. Syntax is problematic for another reason. The levels of embedding found in syntax are often not present in speech. So a famous example, this is the cat that ate the rat that ate the cheese. And in this example, that ate the rat is subordinate to cat, and that ate the cheese is subordinate to rat. But that's not how we say it. We say it like this, where this is the cat that ate the rat that ate the cheese. They're all pretty much equivalent in terms of their phrasing. So it seems that syntax has only an indirect influence on pronunciation and timing. Another type of structure must be the one that influences pronunciation and timing directly. And this structure is called prosodic structure. And here you can see how prosodic structure relates to language and speech. So here's prosodic structure, and you can see that it's right smack in the middle between language, all of these factors, and pronunciation and timing, these factors. And at the same time, notice that it's not only prosodic structure that influences pronunciation and timing, but which vowels and consonants we produce also influence pronunciation and timing. So we saw the example of deed and dad. A deed is shorter than dad. Rate and style also influence pronunciation and timing. So when we speak, we have to somehow weight each of these factors in determining the speech sound durations that we produce. So what is prosodic structure exactly? It has two components. So the first component we can call prosodic constituent structure. And what it does is to group syllables into words words into phrases, phrases into utterances. And what you notice is that this tree here is quite different from the syntactic tree. This is the cat that ate the rat that ate the cheese, that showed lots of levels of embedding. This tree is flatter and it looks more symmetric. And prosodic structure also includes what's called prosodic prominence structure, that includes things like phrasal stress and word level stress. So in this example, Mary's cousin George baked the cake. George and cake sort of stand out. They're the most prominent. They're phrasally stressed. And even in words like cousin, so Mary's cousin George, you can hear that the syllable "ka" is a bit more prominent. It's a bit more stressed than the syllable "zin." So that type of thing is all described as prosodic prominence structure. So going back to our list, where we saw that syntax was problematic and we saw that syntax had only an indirect influence on pronunciation and timing, another factor that's problematic is predictability. So predictability includes how likely a word is given its context and how likely a word is given its frequency of use. So more predictable words are shorter and less acoustically salient. And so this has been observed already in the 60s. So if you have a sentence like, "A stitch in time saves 9," from a well-known proverb, and you compare the 9 in that utterance with the number that you will hear is 9, it turns out that 9 in the second sentence is longer, tends to be longer than the 9 in the first one. So the problem with predictability is that it seems to be doing much of the same work that prosodic structure does in predicting what happens in pronunciation and timing. So if a word is unpredictable, it's more likely to be stressed. So you often hear about health issues on the radio, but you rarely hear about health operas. And so operas has more stress than the word issues. And unpredictable words are more likely to have salient word boundaries. So the number that you will hear is 9. Is often, so the unpredictable word 9 might also be accompanied by cues to the boundary between that word and the preceding word. So one of my students, Matthew Aylett, asked, might prosodic structure be used to control acoustic salience and thereby signal relative predictability? So the idea is that if you compare the predictability of syllables within an utterance, so if you had an utterance like, "Who's the author?" the syllable "ah" in that word, the first syllable in the word author, is probably the least predictable, whereas the syllable "thur," the second syllable in that word, is very predictable because there's not many words in English that start with "ah." I can think of awful, and there might be a few others. The word "the" is very predictable because it's very frequent, and "whose" is also very frequent, but maybe a little bit less frequent than the word "the." And so the idea is that acoustic salience will compensate for predictability. So here, where predictability is low, you would put a stress, so you'd stress this syllable and make it more acoustically salient. But for a word that's already very predictable, you wouldn't have to make it very salient for it to be recognizable. And so the result of having this complementary relationship between acoustic salience, including duration, and predictability, is that you make all of the elements, all of the syllables in an utterance, all of the words in an utterance, equally easy to recognize. This predictability view accounts for effects of utterance length on boundaries. So basic idea is that it's harder to guess the words in longer utterances. So if you had a two-syllable utterance, like, I don't know, my cat, you might either have two monosyllabic words or one disyllabic word. On the other hand, if you had a three-syllable utterance, like my sister, it would be there would actually be four possibilities of how that utterance might be parsed into words. You might have three monosyllabic words, one monosyllabic word, and one disyllabic word, etc. If you have a four-syllable utterance, it gets worse. There are 8 possible ways you could parse a four-syllable utterance into words. But if you stick a salient boundary in, then you have the possibilities. You cut the possibilities way down. So the idea is that longer utterances have more boundaries because it makes the words easier to recognize. So here's how the predictability view fits with the picture that I showed you earlier. So before we saw these language factors like syntax, semantics, pragmatics, and the lexicon, the mental dictionary, but together with utterance length, these factors give us a measure of how predictable the words within an utterance are. And what prosodic structure does for us is it cranks up the salience of the words that are unpredictable, and it doesn't have to do anything for the words that are already predictable because they're already pretty easy to recognize. So the idea is that the sum of predictability and salience gives us recognition likelihood. And if salience is used in this way, then all of the words within an utterance should be equally easy to recognize. So this was Matthew Aylett's PhD and subsequent publications that came out of it. So, Part 1 summary. What is speech timing for? It helps word recognition, both in terms of signaling vowels and consonants, but also in terms of increasing the salience of unpredictable words. And this goal is balanced against other goals, for example, to speak quickly or in rhythm, to give us the surface timing structure of speech. So in Part 2, the question is, how is speech timing controlled? And this represents my current work. And it's collaborative work with Stephanie Shattuck-Hufnagel. We're writing a monograph called How Does Speech Timing Work? And it's also collaborative work with Dave Lee. And my goal for this work is to develop a model of speech timing. That is, I'd like to be able to understand speech timing in order to be able to predict the timing of movements and speech sounds in any context. So in doing something like this, it's always useful to see how much work is already available. And namely, what can we borrow from theories and models of timing control in non-speech motor control? So, but before we can borrow any models or theories, we need to know whether it's appropriate to do so. So we need to know whether the timing control that we use in speech is at all like the timing control that we might use when we type or move our arms or wave or walk or you can think of many types of non-speech motor activities. And then we might want to know whether there is actually anything that might distinguish speech from non-speech timing. So just to clarify what I mean by non-speech movement, here's an example. And here, again, I'd like to invite you to watch the timing. This is in slow motion. So I won't play it with the sound turned on because it won't be that much different. But maybe you can imagine the X-ray video that you saw earlier and think about how they might have been similar or different. So to answer the question of whether speech timing control is like timing control in non-speech, we need technology that allows us to track speech movements. And we are fortunate to have such technology here in Edinburgh. We have what's called an electromagnetic articulograph with a member of the audience featured in it. And what this technology allows you to do is to track the movements of sensors that are glued to the tongue or to the teeth or to the lips, and to track these over time during speech production. And we also glue sensors to the head to control for head movement so that you don't end up thinking that if you see the tongue sensor moving all the way over here, it's probably because the person has moved their head over here and not that they've stuck their tongue out that far. Collaboration with D.K. Arvin has also made it possible to track chest movement during speech using a device that he calls a spec. And the good thing about specs is that they're wireless, and you can use them to measure movement in 3 dimensions, and you can glue lots of them on a person's chest. And you can record them synchronously with other types of signals, like an airflow signal, which is being recorded in that picture. And you can see that that man is still smiling. So, turns out that speech and non-speech show many similarities. And I'll show you several examples. So what you can see here, this is a fairly complicated slide, but the point is that tongue tip movement and finger movement are similar in that their speed profiles are smooth and have a single peak. So what do I mean by that? What I mean is that when you move your tongue tip from a starting position, like in a, to d in ad, so you move it up and touch the roof of your mouth, what happens is that your tongue accelerates to a peak speed and then decelerates. And the same type of thing happens in all kinds of purposeful practice movements, including the fingertip movement trajectory that I've shown you there. So in this figure, this is a horizontal finger trajectory going from a starting position on a flat surface to a target position. And what you can see here is that the movement trajectory looks very similar. And the speed profile is also very similar. So it accelerates to a peak speed and then decelerates. So acceleration followed by deceleration. Simple kind of thing. Oops. Another similarity between speech and non-speech timing is that in both speech and non-speech, we seem to be able to prioritize task requirements and balance those against costs of movements. A famous example is called Fitts' law, which is also known as the speed accuracy trade-off. So what happens when you tell somebody to move to a very small circular target like the one shown here is that if you're told to move quickly, to move to that target quickly, you'll probably miss the target because it's too small. Okay? So being fast incurs an accuracy cost. You're likely to miss it. But if you tell the person you've got to get your finger in that target, then the person is likely to be very slow. So being accurate incurs a time cost, takes longer. So it's not hard to find examples of that in speech. So all of you, I think, have counted very quickly one time or the other. So you usually end up doing something like this: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And if you played those individual digits back, they would be unintelligible. So being fast incurs an accuracy cost. And if I wanted you to be able to clearly understand each of those words, 1, 2, 3, 4, etc., it takes a long time. So being accurate incurs a time cost. Another example. Turns out that human movement is not like the movement of trains. So when you go on a train journey, if you go twice as far, you expect it to take you twice as long. But the same is not true of human movement. In human movement, if you move a longer distance, it takes you a little bit longer, but you speed up, and you actually take a lot less time than you would expect. So here in this figure, this is from the sentence, "Please say a dad." And you can see the tongue tip trajectory for the movement of the tongue from L in please to E in please. And you can see that it doesn't move very far. So there's a little tiny movement trajectory and a little tiny speed peak. So it accelerates to not very fast and then decelerates. And then here in dad, you have a much larger movement trajectory. So the tongue moves from the roof of the mouth in dad, down to dad. Pretty long distance movement. And you can see that the peak speed is much higher, nearly twice as high in dad. Okay, so this is the way that we don't move like trains, but we do move like other types of non-speech movements, including eye movements. There was an example today about men have longer legs, and they have longer strides in walking, and they have higher peak speeds in walking than women do. Okay. So I've just told you that when you move longer distances, you have higher peak speeds. But it's not the case that all of our movements are the same duration. So remember, deed and dad. Dad is slightly longer than deed. It can be from anywhere from 10 to 50% longer than deed. And Harrison Wolpert came up with a possible explanation, namely that the extra duration in dad is required to make dad as accurate as deed. And why should that be? Well, when you issue motor commands to move longer distances, your motor commands are larger than they are when you move shorter distances. The motor commands are larger, but they're also noisier. So if you've got larger, noisier motor commands, then you're less likely to reach an endpoint target when you've moved further. So you need to add some extra duration in order to be equally accurate in your production of dad as you are in your production of deed. So the idea is that our movements represent the optimal balance between speed and accuracy costs. So longer distance movements have higher peak speeds because time is a cost. So we don't want to spend too much time moving, because if we spend too much time moving, we won't get to the rewarding target location in a timely way. But these movements have slightly longer durations in order to meet the accuracy requirements. So you can't make them too fast. So if you make them too fast, then you'll miss your targets. So unless you think that speech timing is like timing in Andy Murray's tennis serve, I'll tell you that speech and non-speech timing are different in some key respects. So timing control in speech is, here's an error. Timing control in speech breathing is different from timing control in non-speech breathing. So when we speak, we tend to take breaths at phrase boundaries. So we exhale, so our exhalation is required to power speech, to create the required sound pressures for speech sounds. And we avoid taking breaths in the middle of phrases. Here you can see some data that we collected using D.K. Arvin's specs. So what you see here is that the interbreath intervals for normal breathing, so this is breathing while watching a video, most of them last approximately 2.5 seconds. Okay, so you can see that most of them are 2.5 seconds long. You get some that are shorter, some that are longer. But you can see that the distribution of interbreath intervals is much more diverse during speech. Okay, and this is consistent with the view that people are postponing their breaths until they get to a phrase boundary and are maintaining their exhalation throughout a phrase in order to power speech. So, in other words, they're taking the linguistic information into account. Breathing accommodates to the message and not vice versa. Another example, this is from work with Satsuki Nakai and several Finnish colleagues. So Finnish is a language which distinguishes word meaning on the basis of vowel length, among other things. So in Finnish, you can have a word like you that has a short vowel, and another word, ti, that has a long vowel. And so the question is, well, Finns do final lengthening just like the rest of us. So what happens when you put the word you at the end of a phrase? Does it turn into ti? And thankfully, it doesn't. So here you can see that the short vowels are all shorter than the long vowels, even though Finnish does have final lengthening. So in Finnish, final lengthening is regulated in order to maintain this distinction. So in planning the durations of these vowels and in planning the type of final lengthening to use, these Finns have to take their linguistic system into account. So there are many other examples that I will not go into because it's getting time to go. But I'll just sum up part 2 by saying that speech timing uses many mechanisms that are used in the control of non-speech movements. But speech is different because it takes additional linguistic information into account that you don't need to use when you're waving your arms around. So speech timing, I think, is arguably even more sophisticated than Andy Murray's tennis serve. So, conclusion. What is speech timing for? Timing control in speech makes words easier to recognize in 2 ways. By making vowels and consonants accurate and by making unpredictable words more salient. And these linguistic goals are balanced against other goals. For example, to speak quickly, to yield surface timing patterns. Many of the mechanisms that we use to achieve surface timing patterns are the exact same mechanisms that we use in non-speech motor activity. But in speech, we use additional linguistic information to plan the timing of speech movements and speech sounds. Thank you.
This production is copyright the University of Edinburgh.